Welcome to the Tech Savvy Professor podcast, two faculty who love tech and love making it part of their work. I'm Marty Jencius from Kent State University.
And I'm Eric Perry, clinical faculty at Southern New Hampshire University.
We have been doing podcasting for the last two episodes. With part one, we talked about equipment. Then part two, the last episode, we talked about software. And then this third part, we're going to talk a little bit about publishing platforms. So once you have your podcast edited, what are your choices on where it can go? I've done podcasts for a long time. Eric's been a part of them. But I'm curious, Eric, have you ever looked into these kinds of platforms or thought about them?
I'll be honest, Marty, I really haven't. So I haven't looked at this part a whole lot. And I know our outro, and just basic conversations about where these things go and how to tell people to download them, but where we put them and how we put them places, and even monetization, I don't know much about when it comes to podcasts. So I was reading your notes this morning and kind of just surfing around the internet. Pretty excited to hear what you had to say about it, because this has been, kind of your end of the management process of the podcast that I've been involved in.
Yeah, it's I back in, I think, 2006, started doing podcasts. And at that point, I was doing Counselor Audio Source. Actually, I took all the shows from Counselor Audio Source and put them in a radio station, a streamable radio station. So you can find the link. Maybe I'll share it with you, Eric. And it runs 24/7. Just replaying different Counselor Audio Source shows that were like 90 shows deep. My dream was to have a bunch of shows from different podcasts and just do like a programming board where you could go in and see what shows are being played for the day and listen to it on your cell phone or whatever using a radio streaming radio. I still pay for it. It's a monthly charge, and I forget about it. And I have to go back like once a year to see, yeah, I guess it's still working. It's still going. But, maybe someday I'll collect the stuff from the faculty meeting and these shows and have the time and energy to kind of do radio programming of all the different Pod Talk Net podcasts. But right now you can search for, I'll try and find it during the show or share it maybe in the next show, where you can find the old stream shows of Counselor Audio Source. The thing with that, back in those days, you had to write your own RSS feed, which is real simple syndication feed. And there were some feed writers that you could put in information, and then it would add it on to the top part of your feed. And basically that's what, if you're using a podcatcher or an app on your phone to go get something, it's reading the RSS feed that tells you there's a new episode there, and it goes and grabs it for you if you're subscribed. But we had to write that or have that written for us and then submit that every week with a new podcast. You'd had to submit it to all the different places you wanted. So you'd have to submit it to Apple. You'd have to submit it. So there was a lot of manual work that goes along with it post-production of the podcast. You also didn't have a place to store them, so you had to have them on a folder where the RSS feed would direct to pull down the podcast from. That's all changed. In the most recent years, it's changed. And when I started doing podcasting again, maybe 6 years ago with the faculty meeting, and other podcasts that we had, this was part of it at one point, I started using Libsyn. Libsyn was really highly recognized, but the costs added up for it because each show you put into Libsyn had its own thread, had its own placement, and had its own charge. And the charge varied depending on how much of the stats you want from it. And Libsyn would upload the file to there. It would take care of all the RSS feed. It would send it out to whatever services you wanted to send it out to, but it was a monthly charge for each podcast or program that we did. And you can look at it. It's still considered Libsyn.com. It's still considered probably one of the best in the business. And it has different pricing ranges depending on how much you want of, if you're going to create a show and you're going to put it out every other day, then you probably want the high-end expensive version, which I think is $15 a month. And then they have lower versions for other ones. I still have some podcasts residing on Libsyn.com because they keep the archive. That's the thing. Once they have them all there, you can't easily move them to another service without a lot of work. And I don't necessarily want to move those old podcast series to another service. So we'll get into what I'm using now. Do you have any questions or ideas about those?
No, it's interesting. Like I took a look this morning, and it's funny because a lot of the ones that I found, Libsyn came up really quickly. It was a top search result. And one of their YouTube videos that they have posted on their front page is how to start under $100, right? That's interesting, but you can see with the model how it stacks up. I think something that was interesting is monetization. And that's something that people talk about a lot. I wonder if that's something you can touch on with these platforms and maybe how that works.
Yeah, Libsyn used to be just, this is a place where we'll house your stuff. We'll send out the RSS. These services are now adding in, you can actually record your podcast here. Here's a place that you can send and you can go, similar to the kinds of services we talked about last week, or software, Zencaster, RingR, those types of services where everybody can meet and do the recording. Now our platforms are starting to offer those services too. Monetization, I can speak more of it in terms of Anchor FM, which is now Spotify for podcasters. This podcast comes off of Anchor FM. And each time I put an episode, and so does Circular Firing Squad, so does Grad School Deconstructed, I moved some of these that were continual ones that weren't archives over to Anchor FM. It's, again, now Spotify for podcasters. Spotify bought them. And I moved some of those that were still producing shows over to Anchor because it's free. And they're looking for content, essentially. So they provide this service for content providers for free. Now, what you can do with monetization is a couple of things. I know people who do this on YouTube. They do video channels and they monetize it because you can start monetizing YouTube once you get to so many followers. Same thing with podcasts. It's not necessarily the followers, but you can start the monetization process right away. But the monetization is based on, and what you get is based on the number of downloads that you have. So if you have a show that gets 40 downloads a week and you have to hit a threshold of 1,500 to start getting $1 back from advertising, it's going to take you a while to get there. So the question is, are you going to take your content and interrupt it with a commercial for that kind of monetization? And the commercials and the areas are often left up to the platform to put in. Sometimes you have you could say, I want to do social, things that would be interesting to our listeners. So, a podcast like this, we might get, I wouldn't say Apple, we might get, some tech provider or platform to do to that Spotify has as part of their cache of advertisers. They'll say, well, we'll put this commercial in there. Typically, when you start with monetization on Spotify and you have low numbers or lower than 1,500 downloads a week, what you're going to get is commercials for Spotify. So they use that platform to kind of stick in their own commercial as part of the monetization process. I've made sort of an editorial decision not to do that because once you do that and you start receiving income for it, then you have to figure out how do you handle that with taxes. There's a whole issue of, is this a business? these kinds of things that I don't want to play into. And secondly, for me, I don't want the content interrupted by commercials. I just don't want to have it's educational. It's not monetary for me. So you can opt out. Well, you have to opt in it to do it. And I can opt in at on any episode I want to, but I've been not opting in on any of them for the podcasts that we have. And unfortunately, you can't do a group of podcasts. So, having 5 of them on Spotify doesn't help me. It's each individual podcast that's looked at in terms of its monetization capabilities. Does that help? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think it does. I mean, you said the word taxes and my stomach dropped, right? So there's a level of complexity to it, I guess, that this adds. You have the opportunity to make money. And I think one of the questions that I've had people ask is, how much is that? Like, what does it look like? Is there a big earning potential here? Especially with, TikTok and other social media platforms where you see a lot of clips, popular podcasts that are video recorded. So they're vlogs posted there. And that's how they kind of drive their podcast subscriptions.
Yeah, I'd like to see myself not as a social media influencer. I like to see myself as a social media educator, because I'm not interested necessarily in being an influencer. And I don't know what goes with that job description. So I don't worry about clicks as long as I'm happy with what I'm doing and the people who listen to it are happy with what we're doing. So monetization is a thing. I had a friend who had a teenage son, who was posting like video game clip ideas or cheats and things like that. What?
A lot of these like blogs, they'll cast or stream their play while they comment, while they play through video games or play through online multiplayer is a big one. Things like Fortnite, Call of Duty, those types of games.
Yeah, and he got on YouTube. He started his own YouTube streaming channel, and it became a major source of income for this kid. And so I have no dreams of being the next great internet sensation, and frankly, don't want to be in that whole game. But people do it. They make money off of it. And so, it is possible to monetize. Another thing that folks will do is you'll see some of these like networks or podcast networks. If you listen to a lot of podcasts, they'll say part of the so-and-so network or part of this particular network. Well, you can join those networks for a subscription fee and get more content from the provider. So they're monetizing it in that way by collecting series of podcasts that are of interest to people, and then saying, here's our network. You pay this monthly fee and you get additional content under this network. We fall under the podtalk.network. Somebody asked me, what is that? You have your own network? I'm like, yeah, I just named it, created a website, and decided to put all the podcasts underneath it. It's not like I'm charging you a subscription for it. It's just the podtalk.net. And it felt like that theme encompassed the kind of work that people are doing with the podcast. So that's another way that people monetize it through subscription services that are really common. I want to mention Podbean. So I think Anchor FM is great. Spotify for podcasters. Incidentally, I did a class on podcasting yesterday to 22 international teachers, and we had enough time at the end of the class, and I brought in my whole collection of little soldiers microphones that I have. And a couple of the groups went to different parts of the room and recorded their first podcast. So that was pretty exciting, and they were real excited about it. So they're going to try and go through the process of setting something up on Spotify or Anchor FM. There are other ones like Podbean, which is another popular service that is a free service up to a point. Generally, when things stop being free services, it's because the amount of content you're uploading, the type of the storage that you're uploading, the storage that they're keeping for you and the type of analytics that you want back from the particular podcast. But Podbean is another one that I know a lot of people have used as a source. When you upload to Spotify, you have to put some content information in. Like you have to have a graphic. You have to have two graphics, actually. And this, if you think about it, if you look at podcasts on various services, you have to have a square graphic that shows up, on your app when you're looking at the podcast. And you also have to have a banner graphic should they choose to highlight your show. So both of those graphics have to be part of your inclusion in when you're submitting an episode. If you've submitted an episode before, you don't have to upload the graphic again. They wind up using the same graphic. When you set these services up for the first time, you need to create one podcast, and it might be a week to 2 weeks for it to be processed through. And what I mean by that is new podcasts, and particularly the first episode of podcasts, are listened to by the services. So Apple makes a decision to some degree by either through AI listening to it or through an actual human being listening to it. There's some time for them to make a decision to add it into their service. So when I've started new podcasts or when I'm working with other people starting new podcasts, I say, okay, you're excited. You got your first show. Now you're going to have to wait a week to 10 days because you're going to submit it and you don't want to advertise it until it's out on all the sources. Spotify has a series of when you're creating a podcast, what sources do you want it to link to? And they kind of do that stuff automatically, but it won't show up in various sources like Google Play. I think you actually have to go and turn that switch on in Google Play. Apple, you just kind of have to wait. You can check on it and find out where it is in the process, and you'll get a notice from Apple saying that it's been accepted. And then you can search for it through the Apple Podcasts or just online through their podcast sourcing, and you'll see it. And then you go, okay, it's ready to go. I can announce it. So it's a little bit of like waiting for Christmas when you know what the present is going to be. But that first episode is the most daunting, and it's like you want to tell the world it's out there, but it's not there yet. Is part of that process.
Yeah, I mean, I think the question I had on this one the most, and talking with a few people, was how difficult is this? How technical is it? And it sounds like there's some things you need to get started, but editing is probably the most technically involved part of this. This is a lot of filling things out, having your graphics ready, having your files ready, and just walking through the process. So when you get on one of these services to post your podcast, it sounds like it's fairly intuitive.
Once you get started, and getting started, it's easy. There's a lot more with your first podcast and getting it established with the service. Besides the graphics, you have to come up with sort of a description of what the show is about. And then for each episode, you come up with a title and a description of what that episode is about. So, we have if you look at our stuff, we have an overall description of who we are, what we're doing, but we don't have what we're going to talk about necessarily other than technology and then each episode has its own little short description. So, when I upload another episode, I've got the graphic, I put it in. It now takes me 10 minutes to upload a new episode. But the first run through and getting the whole thing set up can be a little daunting. I suggest that if you have a title for a show, that you research that title, do an internet search on it, because you want to make sure nobody else is using that title for whatever purpose. And to some degree, nobody else has used that title. So Tech Savvy Professor, I did a search on and found no one else was using that title. Actually, I saw somebody who probably stole our title and started a podcast called The Tech Savvy Lawyer, because it was, from our first generation to this new generation, he starts a podcast called The Tech Savvy Lawyer. And then we start back with Tech Savvy Professor. So you do want to research it to make sure that, because your title that you come up with, probably somebody else has already come up with, or at least you want to make sure you're not dealing with any copyright issues or conflicts.
Sure. Yeah, no, it makes sense. I'll tell you this, my favorite part of CFS, other than the recording itself, is finding show titles. Those individual episodes. We have a lot of fun with that. I mean, here it's a little, we pre-plan, we prepare for these episodes ahead of time, but those are a little more off the cuff. So we come up with those based on what happens during the podcast. And I think that's a lot of fun.
Yeah. And the idea of the show title there is to pull people in from the title. It's like, what is that? And then they'll look at the description. Then they'll wonder, okay, so how is this used in this whole show? And then you'll hear the title pop up in someone's conversation. This show, we can't hide it. We're trying to let people know, if you're listening to this show, you're going to learn about podcasting. In this particular episode, you're going to learn about platforms. And next week, we're going to talk about what?
I think we're going to talk about choice-based learning, or, another way to say that is online interactive activities and how you build those. It seems like a complex thing, and it can be. But there's some really simple ways if you want to integrate some choice-based learning into your courses using your LMS, and some tools that I want to recommend and talk about.
Okay. So we're walking out of my safe space and we're walking into your safe space next episode, which is cool,
Right.
Which is cool. So any other things you want to talk about with reference to this platform things or questions that you have?
No, I think you covered it well. A lot of the questions that came out for me is just talking to peers and colleagues who are really looking to get into this. And I think this 3-part series can really help get them started. I think we've covered kind of all the bases here, and it was fun to explore, being that this was nothing I knew much about.
All right. Well, next week, we're going to talk about, again, or next episode, I should say, which is next week, we're going to talk about these experiential kind of learning pieces that you can do within online learning. And Eric will be taking the leads on that. So how can listeners get involved? Well, maybe you have a tech question, or you're trying to figure out how to do something with technology, or you have an idea you'd like to share. Email us at thepodtalknetwork@gmail.com, or call and leave a message at 330-333-1240, and we'll play your question in the podcast and try and get an answer for you. Our bumper music is from Philip Gross, Rast, from the Free Music Archive. That's it for today's show. Thanks for subscribing to the Tech Savvy Professor podcast. Everything you need to know is at techsavvyprofessor.net. You can find us by searching Apple Podcasts for the Tech Savvy Professor. Look for us on Spotify, TuneIn, Google Play Music, and look for our other shows like Circular Firing Squad on thepodtalk.net. Thanks for listening to the Tech Savvy Professor.